Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Ready for a deep dive into one of history's most fascinating civilizations?
Absolutely.
We're talking Sumerians.
Yes,
The folks who really kick things off in Mesopotamia,
that's right.
the land between the rivers. Now, I know you're probably thinking writings, ziggurats, got it.
Right.
But trust me, there's so much more to uncover.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to go way beyond the textbook basics. In fact, let's start with a little twist. The name Sumerian itself.
Okay.
You might be surprised to learn that it's not what they called themselves.
Wait, really? I've always just assumed Sumerian was their own term. What did they actually call themselves then?
They used the term Kengir, which translates to land of the noble lords.
Land of the noble lords.
Pretty strong statement about their identity, right? It highlights how they saw themselves as distinct from nomadic people, and their sophisticated cities were a big part of that distinction.
Land of the noble lords. I like it. It definitely sets the scene for a complex civilization. But so, if they didn't use Sumerian, where did that name come from?
It's a term coined by later scholars based on the Akkadian word Shumer for the southern region of Mesopotamia. The Akkadians were a different group who came later, and they used that word to differentiate the south from their own land. Akkad.
So it's almost like a geographical label that became the name we use today. Kind of like how we might say the West Coast to refer to a whole culture, not just a location.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that names and labels can evolve over time, and they don't always reflect how people saw themselves. Speaking of labels, both the Sumerians and Akkadians used terms that emphasize the idea of black-headed people to describe themselves. We're not entirely sure why, but clearly distinct identities were a big deal back then.
Okay, so we've got these black-headed, sophisticated city dwellers. But where did they come from in the first place? Did they just appear out of nowhere?
Yeah.
Their origins are still a bit of a mystery, but one prevailing theory points to a migration from the Indus Valley. That's modern-day northwest India and Pakistan.
Wow.
Imagine that journey, all the way to southern Mesopotamia. It makes you wonder how those early interactions and movements shaped the region.
That's a huge GE journey. What makes scholars think there's a connection between the Indus Valley and Sumer?
Linguistic clues, for one. Sumerian is what we call a language isolate. It doesn't seem to fit neatly into any known language family, except there are some intriguing links to the Dravidian languages.
Dravidian languages, refresh my memory.
Think Southeast India today. That's where they're mainly spoken.
Okay.
But if you imagine a map of ancient migration routes, this possible connection between Sumerian and Dravidian languages opens up a whole new chapter in the story. It suggests cultural exchange and movement over vast distances.
So instead of a sudden mass arrival, we're talking about a gradual blending of cultural elements, including language, from the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia. That's incredible to think about. It really paints a different picture of how civilizations emerge.
Precisely. And once they settled in Mesopotamia, what truly made the Sumerians stand out was their incredible urban development. We're not just talking about villages here. We're talking about the rise of the city-state, a defining feature of their civilization.
City-states. Now we're talking. I think of ancient Greece when I hear that term. Was it a similar setup in Sumer?
In some ways, yes. Each city-state was like its own mini-kingdom with its own ruler, its own patron deity, and its own set of laws and customs. But instead of mountains and valleys separating them, like in Greece, the Sumerian city-states were nestled along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Okay, so picture this. A network of independent cities, each vying for power and resources, all within this fertile river valley. It sounds like a recipe for both collaboration and conflict. What were some of the key players in this Sumerian city-state game?
Oh, there are many. Some of the most prominent were Uruk, where the legendary Gilgamesh supposedly ruled, Ur, known for its impressive royal tombs, and Lagash, which boasted a sophisticated irrigation system.
Wow.
Each city had its own unique character and contributed to the overall tapestry of Sumerian civilization.
It's amazing to think that these cities were flourishing thousands of years ago. What was life like inside one of these Sumerian city-states?
Well, imagine walking through the city gates and entering a bustling world of activity.
Okay.
You'd be surrounded by towering mud brick walls designed to protect the city from both invaders and the unpredictable floods of the rivers.
Mud brick walls, huh? That's pretty resourceful. But how did they get all that mud up so high? Were these walls like super thick and massive?
They were certainly substantial. Some of them were several meters thick and could reach impressive heights. The Sumerians were incredibly skilled builders and engineers, using simple materials like mud and reeds to create remarkably durable structures.
Okay, I'm picturing a scene straight out of an epic movie. These massive mud brick walls, the hot sun beating down. What else would I see as I enter this city?
Well, right away, you'd notice the most prominent structure in the city, the ziggurat.
Okay.
Imagine a massive stepped pyramid towering over the surrounding buildings. It was the religious and ceremonial heart of the city, dedicated to the city's patron deity.
A ziggurat. Those are those iconic stepped pyramids, right? Sort of like a Mesopotamian version of the Egyptian pyramids, but with a more, I don't know, layered look.
Exactly. And while the Egyptian pyramids were primarily tombs for pharaohs, the ziggurats served a different purpose.
Okay.
They were believed to be the dwelling places of the gods, and priests would ascend to the top to perform rituals and offer sacrifices.
So it's like a stairway to heaven, literally connecting the earthly realm with the divine. Were ordinary people allowed to go up there, or was it just for the priests?
The top levels were usually restricted to priests, but the ziggurat complex often included courtyards and shrines that were open to the public. People would come to pray, seek guidance from oracles, and participate in festivals and celebrations.
So it was a place of both spiritual and social activity, a real focal point for the community. What about the palace? Was it as grand as the ziggurat?
The palace was impressive as well, though maybe not as tall as the ziggurat. It was typically a complex of buildings and courtyards, housing the ruler, their family, and their court.
I bet there were some lavish parties happening in those courtyards. Okay, so we've got the ziggurat, the palace. What else would I encounter as I wander through this city? Were there shops, markets, houses, all the usual things you'd find in a city?
Absolutely. The Sumerian city-state was a vibrant hub of activity. You'd find bustling marketplaces filled with merchants selling everything from textiles and pottery to spices and precious metals.
Wow.
There were workshops where skilled artisans crafted jewelry, tools, and weapons.
Yeah.
And of course, there were residential areas where people lived in houses made of mud brick, often with small courtyards for gardens and family gatherings.
So it was a pretty self-sufficient system with everything you need to live and thrive, all within the city walls. But how did they keep everything running smoothly? Did they have some kind of government or leadership structure?
This is where we get into the fascinating world of Sumerian politics and their unique concept of divine kingship. It's a story that blends religion, power, and the delicate balance between the human and divine realms.
Divine kingship. Okay, you've definitely got my attention now. This is where things start to get really interesting.
Oh, it gets fascinating. We'll delve into how Sumerian rulers were seen as representatives or stewards of the gods, tasked with maintaining order, justice, and prosperity for their city.
So it's not just about ruling with an iron fist, but about acting as a kind of intermediary between the gods and the people.
That's right.
Sounds like a pretty weighty responsibility.
Right. It was. And as we explore this concept of divine kingship further, you'll see how it shaped not only the political landscape of Sumer, but also their religious beliefs, their art, and their overall understanding of the world. But for now, let's take a step back and look at the broader political structure of Sumer.
Okay, I'm ready for the bigger picture. We talked about city-states, each with their own ruler, but how did they interact with each other? Was it all about cooperation, or were there power struggles and conflicts?
Well, let's just say that Sumerian politics was rarely boring.
Okay.
The relationship between the city-states was complex and constantly shifting, with periods of both collaboration and conflict.
Okay.
Sometimes they'd team up to defend against a common enemy, but just as often, they'd be at each other's throats over resources, territory, or just plain old rivalry.
So it was a bit of a balancing act, trying to maintain your city's independence while also navigating the alliances and rivalries with your neighbors. Were there any particular cities that stood out as major players in this political game?
Oh, absolutely. And the rise and fall of these cities, the shifting alliances, and the ambition of their rulers make for some truly captivating stories. For instance, there's Lugal-Zaggisi of Umma.
Lugal-Zaggisi. Okay, that's a name I haven't heard before. What's his story?
Well, he was a ruler with some serious ambitions. In the 24th century BCE, he embarked on a series of conquests, uniting Sumer and Akkad under his rule. He even claimed to have extended his influence as far as the Mediterranean Sea.
Wow, talk about a power grab. He was aiming for a full-blown empire. Did he succeed in creating this massive Sumerian superpower?
His empire was relatively short-lived, but it was a significant moment in Mesopotamian history. Lugalzagesi was one of the first rulers to articulate the idea of a universal empire, claiming that the god Enlil had granted him dominion over all the lands between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. This idea would have a lasting impact, inspiring later rulers, from the Akkadian kings to the Persian emperors and even Alexander the Great.
So, even though his empire didn't last, Lugalzagesi's ambition set a precedent for centuries of empire building in the region. It's amazing how these early power struggles can have such a ripple effect throughout history.
Absolutely. And speaking of power struggles, we can't talk about Sumerian politics without delving into the fascinating world of their religious beliefs.
Okay.
Remember that concept of divine kingship we mentioned earlier?
Oh, yes. I'm eager to hear more about that. It sounds like their religious beliefs were deeply intertwined with their political structure.
You're exactly right. In fact, you could say that religion was the bedrock of Sumerian society. They believed in a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with their own powers and domains. And the king, as the representative of the gods, played a crucial role in mediating between the divine and human realms.
Okay, so it's not just about having a powerful army or controlling vast territories. It's about having the gods on your side.
Yeah.
How did this concept of divine kingship actually play out in practice? Were there any specific rituals or beliefs that reinforced the king's authority?
Well, for starters, Sumerian kings weren't just born into power. They had to prove their worthiness to rule. They believed that the gods chose the king. And the king's success or failure was seen as a reflection of the god's favor. So imagine the pressure.
I can only imagine. Talk about a performance review. So how did they go about proving their worthiness? Were there tests, trials, or maybe even divine signs they had to interpret?
They had to demonstrate both their piety and their ability to lead. One key aspect of this was performing elaborate rituals and offering sacrifices to the gods. They also had to be skilled warriors, capable of defending their city and expanding its territory. And of course, they had to be just and compassionate rulers, ensuring the well-being of their people.
So it's not just about being a warrior king or a priestly figure. It's about embodying all these qualities at once. Sounds like a pretty tall order.
It was. And to further legitimize their authority, Sumerian rulers often sought coronation in a very special city, Nippur. This city was dedicated to Enlil, the head honcho of the Sumerian pantheon, the god of wind and storm.
Nippur. I'm sensing this was more than just another city-state.
You're right. Nippur wasn't about vying for political power in the same way as the others. Instead, it was seen as a sacred center, a unifying symbol amidst the fragmented landscape. Rulers from other city-states actually sought coronation in Nippur to legitimize their authority and gain recognition as supreme monarchs.
So it's like a pilgrimage to Mecca for a Muslim, or a coronation at Westminster Abbey for a British monarch. A way of seeking higher legitimacy and connecting to something larger than themselves.
Exactly. Even in a world of competing city-states, there was a shared recognition of Nippur's significance. And the ritual of seeking approval from Enlil's temple there reinforced a sense of Sumerian identity that transcended political boundaries. It's a remarkable example of how religious belief can act as a unifying force, even amidst intense rivalries.
This is all so fascinating. We've covered so much ground already, but I feel like we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore about Sumerian culture, their innovations, their art, their literature. Can't wait to dive deeper.
I'm just as excited. We've only just scratched the surface of this incredible civilization. There are stories of ambitious rulers, tales of gods and monsters, and a legacy of creativity and ingenuity that continues to inspire us today.
Let's not forget their legal codes, their advancements in mathematics and astronomy, and the everyday lives of the people who lived in these bustling cities. There's a whole world waiting to be discovered.
And discover it we shall. But for now, we'll leave you with a thought to ponder. Imagine yourself standing at the foot of a towering ziggurat, the sun beating down on the mud brick walls, the sounds of the city swirling around you. What secrets do you think those ancient walls hold? What stories are waiting to be told? We'll uncover those mysteries and more when we continue our deep dive into the world of the Sumerians.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Sumerian civilization. Last time we left off with you standing at the foot of a ziggurat, imagining the secrets held within those ancient walls. Well, let's unlock some of those secrets. I'm ready. I'm especially intrigued by that concept of divine kingship. It's such a different way of thinking about leadership than what we're used to today. Did all Sumerian rulers embrace this idea equally, or were there variations and challenges to that authority?
That's a great question. While the concept of divine kingship was a core belief, how it played out in practice wasn't always so straightforward. Remember, Sumer wasn't a unified empire, but a collection of independent city-states, each with its own ruler and patron deity.
Right. It was like a network of many kingdoms all jostling for power and influence. So how did this idea of divine kingship work within that competitive environment? Were there ever conflicts between the king's authority and the will of the gods, or challenges from other powerful groups?
Oh, absolutely. There were always tensions and power struggles. Sometimes a king might overstep his bounds or face opposition from powerful priests who claimed to have a closer connection to the gods.
So it wasn't just about wearing a fancy crown and claiming divine authority. You had to constantly prove yourself and navigate these complex relationships. What's fascinating here is how that must have shaped the king's decision-making. Were there any examples of a king's actions being questioned or challenged based on those religious beliefs?
There are records of kings being criticized for failing to appease the gods, leading to droughts, floods, or military defeats. And sometimes powerful priests might even challenge a king's authority, directly claiming that he had lost the god's favor. It was a delicate balancing act, and not every ruler managed to pull it off successfully.
It makes you wonder how much of their decision-making was driven by genuine religious belief and how much was political strategy. Did they genuinely believe they were chosen by the gods, or was it a way to legitimize their power and control the masses?
That's a question that's difficult to answer definitively. Likely it was a mix of both. The line between religious belief and political expediency can be blurry even today. But the fact that these beliefs were so deeply ingrained in Sumerian culture suggests that they had a profound impact on how they understood the world and their place within it.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to how we view Sumerian leadership. It wasn't just about brute force or military might, it was about navigating these religious beliefs and expectations. Speaking of navigating complexity, we talked earlier about how Sumerian city-states interacted with each other. Were there any systems or institutions in place to manage those relationships, or was it just a free-for-all?
Well, there wasn't any formal overarching government or legal system that bound all the city-states together, but they weren't operating in complete isolation either. There were certain customs, treaties, and religious institutions that helped to regulate their interactions.
So a bit like the Wild West, but with a touch of divine intervention thrown in. What kind of customs or treaties are we talking about? Was it all based on word of honor, or did they have some form of written agreements?
They did have written agreements. In fact, the Sumerians are credited with developing one of the earliest known legal codes, the Code of Ur and Uruk. It covered a wide range of issues from property rights and inheritance to punishments for crimes.
Wow, a written legal code. That's incredibly advanced for a civilization that existed thousands of years ago. What kinds of punishments did their laws include? Were they harsh, or did they have a more nuanced approach to justice?
The punishments could be quite severe, including fines, corporal punishment, and even death for certain offenses. But the code also showed a concern for fairness and proportionality. For example, it distinguished between intentional and accidental crimes and offered some protections for vulnerable groups like widows and orphans.
So it wasn't just a brutal system of an eye for an eye. There was an attempt to create a system of justice that considered the circumstances and sought to protect the weakest members of society. That's a surprisingly modern concept for such an ancient civilization.
It is, and it speaks to the fact that the Sumerians were deeply concerned with creating a well-ordered society. They understood that laws and justice were essential for maintaining peace and prosperity, and this emphasis on law and order would have a lasting impact, influencing later legal codes in Mesopotamia and beyond.
It's incredible how these early systems of law and governance can still resonate today. It shows a fundamental human desire for order and fairness that transcends time and culture. But law and order is only one piece of the puzzle.
What about the other aspects of Sumerian society? What can you tell us about their family structures, their social hierarchies, the roles of men and women? Sumerian society was definitely patriarchal, with men holding most positions of power and authority. But women weren't entirely excluded from public life. There's evidence that women could own property, engage in trade, and even hold certain religious positions.
So while men were clearly dominant, women still had a degree of agency and influence. Were there any notable exceptions or instances of women breaking through those traditional barriers and achieving positions of power or prominence?
We do have records of some remarkable women who defied those norms. For example, there was Enheduanna, a high priestess in the city of Ur, who is considered the world's first known author. Her hymns and poems are not only beautiful works of literature, but also offer valuable insights into Sumerian religious beliefs and the role of women in their society.
And Edwana, the world's first known author. That's incredible. I love how her story challenges our assumptions about women's roles in ancient civilizations. It's a reminder that history is full of surprises and that women have always been making their mark, even if their voices weren't always recorded or recognized.
Exactly. And speaking of voices from the past, the Sumerians left behind a rich literary tradition that offers a glimpse into their worldview, their beliefs, and their everyday lives. We've already mentioned the Code of Ornamu, but perhaps their most famous literary work is the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Ah, Gilgamesh. The king, the hero, the legend. I remember studying that epic in college, it's a wild ride. But what makes it so significant, and what does it tell us about Sumerian culture?
The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest surviving works of literature, and it explores universal themes that still resonate with us today. Love, loss, the search for immortality, the meaning of life and death. It tells the story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, and his adventures with his wild friend Enkidu.
It's not just a story about a heroic king. It's a story about friendship, mortality, and the human search for meaning. And those themes are as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. It's amazing how a story from such an ancient civilization can still speak to us on such a deep level.
It really is, and it reminds us that despite all the differences in time and culture, human beings have always grappled with the same fundamental questions about our existence. And the Sumerians, with their sophisticated writing system and their rich literary tradition, left us an incredible legacy that allows us to connect with them across the millennia.
It's like we're having a conversation with them through their writing, their art, their artifacts. And that's what I love about history. It's not just about memorizing dates and facts. It's about connecting with the human experience across time.
But speaking of facts, there's one thing we haven't touched on yet that I'm particularly curious about. Their advancements in mathematics and astronomy. They were known for being quite innovative in those fields, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The Sumerians were pioneers in mathematics and astronomy, developing systems that would influence later civilizations for centuries to come. Their innovations in these areas were driven by practical needs, but also by a deep curiosity about the world around them. Okay, I'm ready for a math and astronomy lesson. What were some of their key discoveries or innovations? Do they have telescopes, observatories, or some kind of ancient supercomputers?
They didn't have telescopes or computers as we know them, but they were remarkably adept at observing the night sky and developing mathematical systems to track the movements of the stars and planets.
I can picture those Sumerian stargazers, gazing up at the night sky, mapping out the constellations, and trying to make sense of the cosmos. What were some of the specific things they were trying to figure out? Was it purely for scientific curiosity, or did their astronomy have practical applications?
Their astronomy served both practical and religious purposes. By carefully observing the stars, they could develop calendars to track the seasons, which was crucial for agriculture. They also used their astronomical knowledge to predict eclipses and other celestial events, which they believed held religious significance.
So it was about understanding the rhythms of nature and connecting them to the divine. It's like they were weaving together science, religion, and everyday life into a seamless tapestry. What about their math? What were some of their key achievements in that area? Did they invent calculus or something equally mind-blowing?
While they didn't invent calculus, they did develop a sophisticated number system based on 60, which we call the sexagesimal system.
Sexagesimal system. Okay, that sounds complicated. How does a system based on 60 work, and why did they choose that number?
It's actually quite elegant. The number 60 is divisible by many numbers, which makes calculations easier. We still see remnants of their sexagesimal system today in our measurement of time, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and angles 360 degrees in a circle.
Hold on, are you telling me that we owe our way of measuring time to the ancient Sumerians? That's mind-blowing. I never realized that connection before.
It's true. Their mathematical legacy is still with us today, even if we don't always realize it. And it highlights their ingenuity and their ability to develop systems that were both practical and intellectually stimulating.
It makes you wonder what other innovations or discoveries we might attribute to the Sumerians if we could fully decipher all their ancient texts and uncover all their hidden secrets. It's like a giant puzzle waiting to be solved.
It is. And with every new archaeological discovery, we're piecing together a more complete picture of this remarkable civilization. Their legacy is vast and complex, and we're still learning from them today.
Speaking of learning, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from their political structure and religious beliefs to their legal codes, their literature, and their advancements in mathematics and astronomy. But I can't help but wonder about the everyday lives of the people who lived in these bustling city-states. What was it like to be a Sumerian, to walk those streets, to work in those fields, to raise a family in the shadow of a ziggurat? What can you tell us about the heartbeat of Sumerian life?
Ah, that's a great question. And it leads us to the heart of what makes during history so fascinating, connecting with the human experience across time. Let's shift our focus now to the sights, sounds, and even the smells of daily life in a Sumerian city. Imagine yourself stepping back in time.
Okay, I'm ready to time travel. Let's walk those ancient streets together and see what life was really like for the people who built this incredible civilization. I'm already picturing the bustling marketplaces, the skilled artisans, the farmers working their fields. But I'm sure there's much more to uncover.
Oh, there's a whole world waiting to be explored. We'll delve into the details of their homes, their clothing, their food, their music, their games, their rituals, and their beliefs about life and death. And through those details, we'll gain a deeper appreciation for the ingenuity, the resilience, and the enduring human spirit that shaped this remarkable civilization.
Lead the way. I'm eager to see where this deep dive takes us next. All right, I'm ready to step back in time and experience daily life as a Sumerian. Last time, you mentioned bustling marketplaces, skilled artisans, and farmers tending their fields. Let's start with the heart of the city, the marketplace. What would that have been like?
Imagine a kaleidoscope of sights, sounds, and smells. You'd be surrounded by stalls overflowing with colorful textiles, glistening pottery, and baskets piled high with dates, figs, and other exotic fruits.
Okay, my senses are already on overload. I can hear the merchants hawking their wares, smell the spices from distant lands, see the gleam of gold and silver jewelry. What were some of the most sought-after goods in the Sumerian marketplace?
Well, textiles were a big deal. Wool, linen, and even imported silk were woven into intricate patterns and vibrant colors. Pottery, of course, was essential for everyday life, from simple cooking pots to elaborate vessels for religious rituals. And let's not forget about those cylinder seals we talked about earlier, those tiny carved masterpieces that served as personal signatures and symbols of status.
Right, the cylinder seals. It's amazing how something so small could hold so much artistic detail and cultural significance. But it wasn't all about luxury goods, was it? What about the everyday essentials? Where would people get their food, their tools, their building materials?
The marketplace was a one-stop shop for everything. Farmers brought their fresh produce, livestock, and grains from the surrounding countryside. Fishermen sold their catch from the rivers and canals. Toolmakers offered everything from sturdy plows to delicate woodworking tools. And of course, there were vendors selling street food. Think flatbreads, roasted meats, and maybe even some early versions of dates dipped in honey.
Okay, now I'm officially getting hungry. It sounds like the Sumerian marketplace was a vibrant mix of commerce, culture, and community. A place where people from all walks of life came together to barter, socialize, and get a taste of the city's energy. But what about life beyond the bustling marketplace? What were their homes like?
Most Sumerians lived in modest houses made of mud brick, often clustered around courtyards for shade and ventilation. The courtyards were a center of family life, a place to cook, eat, socialize, and even sleep during the hot summer months.
Mud brick houses clustered around courtyards. It sounds like a very communal way of living with families sharing space and resources. Were there any differences in housing based on social status? Did the wealthy have more elaborate homes?
Absolutely. The wealthier families, merchants, and officials might have larger homes with more rooms, perhaps even a second story. They might decorate their walls with colorful murals or mosaics and furnish the rooms with imported woods and fine textiles.
So while everyone was dealing with the challenges of a hot climate and limited building materials, there was still room for personal expression and social differentiation. What about clothing? What did people wear in ancient Sumer?
The basic garment for both men and women was a simple tunic, often made of wool or linen. Men might wear a fringed shawl over their tunic, while women often draped a long shawl or cloak over their shoulders.
And what about footwear? Were they sporting sandals, some kind of ancient sneakers, or going barefoot?
Sandals were the footwear of choice, often made of leather or woven reeds, but many people probably went barefoot, especially inside their homes and courtyards.
I can imagine. When it's that hot, who needs shoes? What about jewelry and accessories? Did they have a taste for bling?
They certainly did. Jewelry was a popular way to express personal style and social status. Men and women both adorned themselves with necklaces, earrings, bracelets, and rings, often crafted from gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carnelian.
So even in their simple mud brick homes, they found ways to add a touch of elegance and sparkle to their lives. It's a reminder that humans have always had a desire for beauty and self-expression, no matter their circumstances. Speaking of expression, what can you tell us about their music and entertainment? Did they have concerts, festivals, sporting events, or maybe even some early form of theater?
They certainly knew how to have a good time. Music was an integral part of Sumerian culture, used in religious ceremonies, festivals, and even everyday life. They played a variety of instruments, including lyres, harps, flutes, and drums.
I can almost hear the melodies now, echoing through the streets and courtyards. Were there any particular types of music or dances they were known for? Anything that would get our toes tapping today?
We don't have recordings, of course, but based on their artwork and written descriptions, we know they had a rich tradition of both vocal and instrumental music. They likely had songs for specific occasions, love songs, laments, work songs, and hymns to the gods.
It's fascinating to imagine those ancient melodies and rhythms, and to think about how music has always been a way for humans to connect, express themselves, and celebrate life. What about other forms of entertainment? Did they have any games, sporting events, or storytelling traditions?
They were quite fond of board games. Archaeologists have found game boards and pieces that resemble backgammon and checkers. They also enjoyed wrestling, chariot racing, and a game that involved throwing javelins at a target.
So they had their share of competitive spirit. It sounds like they had a good balance of work and play, and they knew how to enjoy themselves. But what about the more serious side of life? What were their beliefs about life and death, and how did those beliefs shape their culture?
The Sumerians had a rich mythology and a complex set of beliefs about the afterlife. They believed in an underworld, ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, where the spirits of the dead went after they died.
The underworld. That sounds a bit ominous. Did they believe everyone went to the same place, or were there different fates for good and bad people?
It seems like everyone went to the same underworld, but their experiences there could vary depending on how they lived their lives and how they were buried. Those who were properly buried and honored with offerings might fare better than those who were neglected or forgotten.
So it was important to treat the dead with respect and ensure they had a smooth journey into the afterlife. Did they have any specific rituals or traditions surrounding death and burial?
They certainly did. Burial rituals were elaborate and played a significant role in their culture. The dead were often buried with grave goods, possessions, food, and even servants to help them on their journey to the underworld.
It's both fascinating and a bit eerie to imagine those ancient burial practices. It shows how deeply they cared for their dead and how their beliefs about the afterlife shaped their actions in this life. It's a reminder that every civilization, no matter how different from our own, grapples with the mysteries of life and death and seeks to find meaning in the face of mortality. And I think that's a beautiful and profound way to wrap up our deep dive into the world of the Sumerians.
I agree. They were truly remarkable people who left behind a legacy that continues to inspire and intrigue us today. Their story is a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit.
Well said. And it's been a privilege to explore their world with you. But our journey doesn't end here. There are countless other civilizations, cultures, and stories waiting to be discovered. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of history.